What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Iron Culture. It is me, Eric Trexler, joined as always by the Dr. Eric Helms. Helms, how are we doing in 2026?
Oh, it's a bold, brand new year. I'm excited. Lots of big changes and big things coming up in my life. Probably the most notable is that it is the 20-year anniversary of my wife and I's marriage. So that's pretty exciting in January. We have kind of a rolling anniversary in January because we had a courthouse marriage early in January, and then for our 5-year recommitment slash finally actually having a wedding ceremony when we could afford it, we had a later January wedding. So we just choose some time in January to acknowledge that it's our anniversary. So neither one of us can be wrong as long as we get the month right.
Yeah.
So low pressure, but big deal. 20 years, man. Makes me feel old.
Yeah, 20 years is a long time. I gotta be honest, man. My perception of time is completely warped. That's a huge flaw of mine, is that I can't seem to keep track of my life or anything related to it. I think my wife and I have been married for a couple years now. I wouldn't be stunned if it were 3. It's certainly more than 1. But we usually allocate more attention to the anniversary of our first date than the anniversary of our marriage, because we were very adamant that neither of us wanted to get married, and then over time I was like, I really would like to get married, and then I asked her and she was like, yeah, that'd be great. And so we were engaged for 6 days, went down to the courthouse, and we were old enough and financially in a place we could have had a wedding if it interested us, but I think both of us, it's kind of like our worst nightmare was having a large wedding ceremony. So we got 2 security guards at the courthouse to be the legal witnesses to sign the paperwork, and the rest was history. So hopefully, Holmes, my wife will put up with me for another 17 to 18 years, and we'll be in your shoes celebrating that 20th.
Well, it's just a hop, skip, and a jump around the corner. Just stay tuned, folks. Wait another 18 years, and we'll see what's happening. Put your bets in now in the comments. We'll definitely remember.
Yeah, and we'll hey, on that episode of Iron Culture, maybe she'll come on. I'm sure we'll do it
Perfect.
every week for the next 25 or 30 years. So we'll join in then.
Yep.
All right, Helms. Anything else new before we dive into the good stuff here?
You know what? Just want to wish everybody a happy new year, and thanks for those who are joining us live. And no, we're just an exciting new era for Iron Culture presented by Mass. That's all.
I feel like a brand new man. I've already deadlifted in the year 2026.
Really?
Which for a person coming off a couple surgeries is a major revelation. Yeah, I basically worked myself until I felt ill today mentally, and I was like, I can't think anymore. And so then the nice thing about working 2 staircases above a weight room is you can go down and deadlift. So I feel stronger than ever before, Helms, starting 2026 on the right foot, and hopefully my abdomen will maintain its integrity and we won't have any revisions to our hernia surgeries. That is the
Well,
goal.
I'm excited.
Yeah.
Trex plus deadlifts equals Eric is happy.
Oh, yeah. All right. So, Helms, let's get to the good stuff. Well, actually, before I do that, we got to get the stuff out of the way. If
right.
you like the show, there's many ways to support it. You can like the video or like wherever you get the podcast. Give it a rating, subscribe, all that stuff. Share the show with a friend. Share it with a few friends. Share it with all your friends, even people you don't like. They can still listen. The downloads still count. If you want to be a member of the platinum level inner circle gold star membership of the Iron Culture audience, you could always check out the MASS Research Review over at massresearchreview.com. It is the engine that keeps Iron Culture going. Iron Culture is presented by MASS, and of course, MASS delivers to you the first of the month every month, the newest updates, the cutting edge science related to your training, your nutrition, and all tangential related topics that pertain to your fitness and performance and health and wellness and everything in between. And then, of course, if you want to support our friends, the good people at Elite FTS, our kind, lovely sponsors with whom we share a lovely partnership. If you're in the market for some high-quality lifting gear, lifting apparel, I personally use their straps. I made the grave mistake of buying 2 pairs back in like 2011. I would have been fine with just one. They never break down. I literally have the second pair in my office now, so now that I'm deadlifting again, and I haven't used them yet. So all I can tell you is that with me, deadlifting like an idiot, using weights that were probably not appropriate based on my strength level when I was in college, I got at least a good decade out of those straps, which is way more than the typical shelf life for a pair of lifting straps. So Elite FTS, like I said, for your apparel or your gym gear, make sure you use our code, which is MRR10, that stands for Mass Research Review 10, for a 10% discount. Now, Helms, let's get down to business here. We've got some science to talk about, and science communication and the philosophy of science, all intersecting in the world of lifting. So this is very much our sweet spot.
Also the history of science.
The history of science, indeed. So Helms, I sent you a message on Instagram. I happened upon a video. It was a video from a science communicator who is in the kind of lifting space. And we're not going to, it's not like a call out video. We're not going to like name and shame them or anything like that. As we've talked about in recent episodes, we are highly interested in discussing ideas. We are not remotely interested in discussing people. We like celebrating people that do impressive things, but we're not into the, getting into the fighting and mudslinging and things of that nature. So we're going to focus on the claims that were made here and talk about why it caught my attention enough for me to send it to you. And so this individual, as a science communicator, really presents themselves as, I would say, there's that kind of spectrum in science communication, right? The I'll try anything, I'm just interested in what works, the very open-minded, optimistic, sometimes so optimistic as to be gullible side. And then the other side of the spectrum is highly skeptical. And in some cases, you'll find the folks who almost view their role as playing defense against the fitness industry, right? And so I'd say this person falls very much on the skeptical, playing defense side of that spectrum, which will come out when we talk more about some of the more philosophical elements of science and communication. But the claims here, Helms, no, don't want to do too long a wind up here. The claims that caught my attention in this video. The first one was, you can never determine whether self-experimentation is resulting in a meaningful outcome. And again, this is in the context of lifting, nutrition, those types of things. So that was the first one that caught my attention. The justification, the next sentence, also caught my attention. So they said, you can never determine whether self-experimentation is resulting in a meaningful outcome because it is literally impossible to reliably calculate the significance of an outcome using a sample size of one person. And later on, they made the third claim, which is you cannot determine if that data point is an outlier in the context of self-experimentation. So Helms, your initial feelings when I sent that to you, were you as incredulous as I was? And did you immediately feel like you were going to need to talk me down from throwing a fit live on the air?
Yes, and indeed. I knew how frustrated you would be, and maybe, and I don't want to paint your emotional response. So you can, of course, share what your emotional response is. But being the professional you are, I also know you'd handle it well. And it made me think of two really, really important things. Is one, just how important in 2025 the three pillars of iron culture are: history, science, and culture. Because every time we see someone leverage one while being ignorant to the other, they make very predictable errors that someone who is aware of these other fields of focus, you could say, would see as that doesn't make any sense. When you're heavily siloed into a given culture, what you believe is possible, normal, is skewed and biased. When you're heavily siloed into just what has been historically done, sometimes you can be surprised or resistant to change, and not know like what could be possible in the future. Like I've definitely seen some people who are just so enamored by a Steve Reeves or a John Grimmick as to go like, well, they are the natty peak potential and nothing could ever extend beyond what they did. And from a stance of nostalgia and reverence, I understand that sentiment, but at the same time, they were coming off of just a few decades prior where lifting weights was literally a circus act. That's how rare it was. Gyms were rarefied, strange places for a unique subculture, and people didn't understand why you do fitness because health and fitness were one and the same. And bodybuilding, if you think it's a subculture now, holy crap, back then. Not to mention, there was a third of the people on the planet, right? So now you've got 3 times as many people on the planet, and 10 times as many of them as proportion are lifting weights. Of course, there's going to be people who surpass even the great Steve Rees and John Grimmick. So these are just some examples. But one thing I'm really glad about having you on Iron Culture, my friend, is that I think more so than me, you have more of a historical knowledge of science specifically, and also the development of statistics. Because you and I are both, I would say, perhaps not the most neurotypical gentlemen in the world. And I express my special interests in a different way than you. I have a diverse number of books on the history of lifting, but I know you are also an aficionado of the history of statistics, which I am not. And in our discussion, you brought up how, like, hey, literally some of the first, I would say, would you say discoveries or pioneering into the field of statistics we generally use in human research, especially in medical or sports history or, sorry, sports science or exercise science, directly conflict with the claim here. So I think maybe that's a good place to start, is the history of stats.
Yeah, not to be hyperbolic, but to be kind of hyperbolic to make a point. The way I phrased it is this is probably the most wrong a thing could be if you view it through a historical lens. The idea that you can never determine whether self-experimentation results in a meaningful outcome, that it's impossible to make any kind of statistical inference using a sample size of one person, because literally, like, there's something called there's an old story, the lady tasting tea, and it is essentially it's widely viewed as basically the first formal conceptualization of null hypothesis testing, right? And the story goes, it's Ronald Fisher, who, if you've ever done stats, you're like, wait a minute, that Fisher? Yes, that Fisher. Don't look into his personal life or feelings or beliefs on the world. I'll say that for all statisticians for the most part. If they're famous and they did most of their work before 1940, don't look into them. It's not good.
Yeah, I think George Box is safe, but
Yeah.
anyone before that, just pretend they are just stats people and nothing else.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, Ronald Fisher invented like a lot of stuff in modern statistics. I'm pretty sure he's the guy who pioneered analysis of variance, the ANOVAs that we find in every exercise science paper for the most part. So the whole idea with lady tasting tea is Ronald Fisher, Helms, you said maybe we're not the most neurotypical people. Ronald Fisher, I've never met the gentleman, the individual, but I'm very confident that he shares that with us, because the whole premise is that he was enjoying tea with a lady, his friend, and she made the claim that she could discern the difference with a cup of tea if you put the milk in before the tea or the tea in before the milk. Now, the average person who's enjoying tea with a lovely friend would say, oh, that's interesting, and they'd probably move on. But he said, I'm going to spend an obscene amount of time destroying you with facts, logic, and novel mathematics that have never been considered. So he basically, this claim racked his brain, destroyed his mental sense of wellness, and he decided, I'm going to invent null hypothesis testing to prove my friend wrong over a claim that is completely not impactful in any way. You know, it's one thing I've talked, I think, on the show about the origin of meta-analysis, which at least was like the British Army saying, hey, we have a lot of soldiers dying of typhoid. We should look into this. But this is literally just a friend calling bullshit on a friend and then saying, I'm going to change statistics forever over this. But so basically what he did in this lady tasting tea story, which was first published, I think, in 1935, is he kind of laid out a foundation for, like, if I disbelieved you, but I wanted to be, just from a probability perspective, reasonably certain that you're full of shit, how would I set up, run, and analyze an experiment to do so? And so he puts out this kind of replication process of, I'm going to give you in a blinded fashion this cup of tea which had milk before the tea, and then this cup which had the tea before the milk. And the question was, over repeated trials, how many times do you get it right? And at what level of probability would I say, if you're getting it right this many times, I'm inclined to just simply believe you, So he basically used this to kind of lay out the concept of null hypothesis testing. What is your null? How will you test it? And then what is the probability at which you feel reasonably confident? And so the reason that this claim kind of got under my skin was, not only can you do null hypothesis testing with a single subject, but it is literally the start of null hypothesis testing. And so I think that, this is one of those things, we talk about it in Iron Culture, but studying history, I think the term that you used, the specific word that jumped out, I think was avoidable when you kind of introed this topic. So making avoidable misinterpretations. And the thing about history is that it is basically, when I was younger, I wasn't into history. I didn't really understand why people study it. It seemed like it was just old people with nostalgia for what used to be. But the older you get, the more you're like, no, this isn't nostalgia. It's just you've seen the same mistakes being made time after time after time. And you start to realize that an appreciation and a study of history is just a shortcut. It's basically a cheat code to say, what if I just don't make the mistakes everyone else did? Or at least as I cover new ground, I'm informed of the biggest mistakes that have been made in similar scenarios. And so I think that having an understanding of the history of statistics really broadens your perspective. Because Helms, I'm sure you've seen this. A lot of biomedical science programs, exercise science programs, they really some of them teach statistics basically in like a cookbook fashion. It's like baking instructions. You follow the flow chart. If you have this and this and this, do the ANOVA. If you have this and that, but only that, then you do t-test. It's kind of a flow chart. Here's your small collection of tools. Make the right choice, but there are like 6 options here. But when you study the history of it and you see the origins, you say, well, what did statistics look like before ANOVA? What did statistics look like before these kind of common tests? And what you start to see is like, oh, this is really just an exploration of the convergence of study design and having a good question and trying to falsify it. And it kind of broadens your perspective of what statistical inference really looks like. And I think that aside from statistics, it's just so critical that that we really embrace how important it is to study history. And I think one of the arguments that's really caught my attention and things unrelated to this lately, Helms, this is a bit of a tangent, but I've seen a lot of people in very different contexts kind of make an argument where they say, well, it's the current consensus. The experts say it's true. Now, far be it from me to make a blanket criticism of scientific consensus or expert agreement, but it's really important to understand that expert consensus or scientific consensus only is worthwhile if there's actual literature. So you're going to find in some fields that there is scientific consensus on paper about topics that are woefully understudied. And that is dramatically different from a scientific consensus on things that are very, very well studied with rigorous work. And the reason I bring that up is I did see in the comments of that post, there's a kind of like, I think I kind of saw the person say, my professors told me that the single subject statistical tests that exist are dumb and not good, which is a nonsensical argument. But also, even if it were the expert consensus, it's really important to recognize like lobotomy, eugenics. These were scientific consensus among experts of their time. We look back at them, and these are things that were highly prevalent within our parents' or grandparents' lifetime. And, we can look back and see how tragically wrong things can be when we refuse to kind of look into the history of how ideas come to be, the scientific basis for it, and if we just kind of use that mental shortcut of, well, so-and-so said it was true, so I'm going to go for it. So all that is to say, when we look at the history of statistics, the history of science, it leaves really important lessons that we really can't gloss over.
That's all super well said, Trex. And I would also say I think we're probably being a little too generous to let's just say that the comment of "Hey, my professor said this" is an accurate representation of what the professor said, and not a hyperbolic version of it to try to help them defend themselves. I assuming that, I think the professor's just wrong if that's the case, because I think when you're siloed within exercise science, or kind of anything even adjacent to our field, you're not necessarily engaging with the top biostatisticians who have really thought about this a lot. And I think if you were to look at the most heavily cited research and papers from biostatisticians on single subject designs, we would find there probably is a relatively strong consensus on a better way to do this. And we would just find out, oh, this is not something most exercise scientists are aware of. And I mean, like this happens all the time in general design of research. Like, I think I saw the first scoping review in medicine, like in exercise science or sports science, like a couple years ago, like in like the 20 teens. And prior to that, people were doing systematic reviews and using them to do the work of scoping reviews because they didn't know they existed, right? So that's just one of those random examples. But there's a ton of things like that where you can't know what you don't know. So yeah, if you were to look at all of the methods used to pick out non-responders, responders, or individual response, or all the things that basically Zach Robinson was on our podcast last time criticizing, you'd go, yeah, that stuff actually doesn't make sense. But when you get legitimate statisticians to think about this and talk about it, and you look into fields where this has been thought of a lot more, you start to realize, oh, maybe our internal little consensus or way of doing things is just frankly not fully informed, and we're just not aware of our blind spots. Because that's what I think is a better representation of this science communicator's approach. And I want to take a brief tangent and one, say kind of why I think there's a specific blind spot there and why it's understandable. But then two, to talk about, and this is almost addressing the person, but it's not, that it's not just the claims that are made, but also you need to critique and think about how does a person think and come up with claims. Because we can keep making these same errors, or keep promoting or following the same people who make predictable, going back to that same word, logical fallacies or critical thinking errors, I think is what this would be.
Yeah, and that was the term.
Just,
I said avoidable, but it was predictable, which is even better.
Yes, predictable, yeah. Right? So I think here's the thing. When you think about in a narrow framing of population-based research, where every individual is a single data point and they have only one contribution to a data set, yes, it is impossible to develop a standard deviation from one single data point. But as soon as you start testing that person multiple times over time, all of a sudden you can conceptualize this as determining what is their standard deviation of that measurement. And then you could use the same quote-unquote rules that we would use to determine whether or not that was a quote-unquote real change, or how large of a deviation from the norm was it. And if you kind of look at, like, say, reliability research, Bland-Altman testing, all these things in a very, very narrow lens, and you're thinking more about, oh, is this measurement reliable? Not remembering that it also encapsulates biological variability. And then you can also think about what is a real change. Now all of a sudden you go, hold on, I'm using a very, very limited scope. So yes, if I maintain myself as, okay, I'm assuming that all research that's done in our field is meant to generalize to a population, rather than actually tell us a fundamentally different question of, did what this athlete, person, case series, case study, whatever, did this individual see a real change? And was it due to cause and effect of whatever combined set of treatments came prior? Then sure, you could make this claim. But that is a relatively, like, why would you make that assumption? And then also, if you were making that assumption, here's the philosophical part that really bothers me. The immediate use of absolutes, the high level of confidence, and then the immediate backpedaling to what my professor said. Like, oh shit, now that I might be wrong and that people are coming in here, let me just do an appeal to an authority, right? That style of thinking tells you something, that this person, either through trying to promote themselves as being confident and a reliable source of information, which could be a promotional thing, which isn't always bad. We all know what we need to do to survive and grow on the algorithm, is giving an air of confidence, which helps, or they are coming at things with far too high of a level of confidence, and they're shouting from the top of the Twin Peaks of Dunning and Kruger, which is something that it does come with a lack of awareness of history, of having not been wrong very many times. But you hope with age you start to go, oh man, when I venture into new areas of thought, discovery, and things that I'm learning, maybe I'm not the first person who ever asked this question. And maybe I should start with this doesn't seem right. Why has no one else picked up on this? Or why are these claims being made? Let me look into it deeper. Or if I look into it and I think I'm right, not use complete black and white absolute statements and just leave the door open for possibilities. Just with the simple humility of going, maybe there could be things that I don't know right now that are forever going to be true always in absolute.
Yeah, and we hate a straw man here, so I found the verbatim quote, and it was basically pushing back into people who are like, there's a lot of stats that you can do with single subject designs. They're very robust. They've been calculated out. There's a whole body of literature. You can look up the stuff John Farron has done. Like, I've met the researchers who do this stuff, and I've said, hey, I love your work. So the response was, I'm in grad school now, and they have hammered home how horrible N=1 tests are for inference on population data. So it's kind of like, well, grad school says otherwise. And also, when people are doing self-experimentation, what do they care about population averages? Like, the whole point of self-experimentation is I want to see what works for me. That's why the unit of investigation is the self. You know what I mean? But I was smiling because a lot of time, you kind of mentioned those Twin Peaks of Dunning and Kruger, and this is in the context of I can empathize with, doing science communication in grad school. But if you look back at the stuff I did when I was in grad school, the tone was very muted. It was not sensational in the least. Because I was always thinking, it'd be like if you were reading, like, you're like, I'm going to read the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, and you get about 30% of the way through, and then you're going out online saying, I'm the foremost expert in Benjamin Franklin history, and you're like, are you sure you don't want to see if there's like a big change that happens in the rest of that book? Like, what if things take a turn, And so I just, when I would learn things in grad school, I would, even when I thought I was onto something big, I would keep it to myself. And oh my God, Helms, was I glad. Because my biggest claim to fame, Helms, in grad school, I invented regression imputation. The problem, and I basically worked it out on my own because it came up as a problem in a study I was doing, and I said, this to me is the most intuitive solution, and I shared it with a couple of my close colleagues, and I said, folks, I'm onto something big. And I invented regression imputation, and then later found there is a term for it. It is regression imputation. It was invented a very long time ago, and also that's like 3 imputation methods in the past because we developed way better ways to do it. So it's one of those things where it's hard to say when you become a science communicator, when is it time to actually step out in the limelight and share rather than learn? And the answer is you never stop doing either, but where you're at in your career stage, and unfortunately it takes a few go arounds, in this whole cycle to figure out when you've actually achieved like bona fide expertise in an area to an extent that you're going to go out and say, oh yeah, I'm bucking the norm on this, and I'm going to go out with a hot take. You know what I mean? Early in your career, when something, this is like my general heuristic I lived by. Early in my career, when it felt like I was getting what no one else was getting, my initial default was, I don't understand this. You know what I mean? Like, there's a very low probability that I'm the first person to get this, given that I've been into it for about 2 weeks. And so I think that's a really important heuristic for people who are, maybe you're a fitness enthusiast, a fitness professional, and communication's part of the game, social media content is part of the game. It's not to say that you can't speak on a topic if you didn't do a dissertation on it, but I think it goes a long way to have some humility in terms of the tone and framing and saying, here's something I'm chewing on. Here's my perspective on it. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. It's very different from saying, I've got some extremely hot takes, and if you disagree with me, you're an idiot. Like, it's a very, very different approach to communication.
Well said. Yeah, and I think is it worth maybe steel manning a little bit some of the. I'll put it this way. I think a lot of the things that people do with anecdotal evidence, with self-experimentation, and of one actual published study designs has many faults.
Oh, yeah.
And like, I would just refer people back to our episode with Zach Robinson, where, we both, you and I, admitted that we didn't think about the variance in response within the individual, and how when you repeat something, it could be just as variable the next time, and why, a single time through a crossover maybe isn't enough to determine individual response. And that's why Zach did a double crossover, and a within participant design, right?
Yeah, and the great shame of that is that you recommended that as the study design, which is a very tedious thing and a long timeline for a dissertation study. And somehow the history suggests that I took the blame for that. And I still don't understand how that happened, but everyone suggests within that dissertation committee that it was my idea. And that I was the mean person that made Zach do all the extra work. And it was not me.
It was definitely me. I think, and the funny thing is, I think James Steele actually pointed out, this is what you'd have to do, but it would be crazy to do that. And I said, but is it that crazy? And then you were just a bystander. I think this might have been one of those times where just the hairs got flipped.
The great irony of it, and I know I think this is all fine to share publicly, and we're live, so it doesn't matter. It's happening. But I chimed into the conversation to say, Zach, how long have you been in grad school? Like, how much time left do you have? Just because I was trying to figure out how unconscionable it would be to force someone to do this prolonged multiple trial crossover experiment. And it was misremembered universally, such that I was saying, oh, we need to keep this guy around way, way, way longer. When in reality, I was just saying, like, if this guy's already been in grad school for 5 years, I don't feel comfortable asking him to do this. But anyway, as you were saying, we kind of admitted in that case that, we hadn't really given that a considerable amount of thought.
Yeah. So I fully agree that most of the individual response literature within exercise science and nutrition as well is ignoring a very, very large source of variance, the repeatability within a given person. And it's only been in the last several years. And I would say Zach Robinson is probably the world-leading authority, at least in exercise science, on this topic, that we've had the ability to actually robustly look at individual response to determine, importantly here, whether or not that response variation is due to some inherent trait of the person. Now, with that said, I think, what does self-experimentation look like in the real world? And we have, anecdotal evidence or expert opinion is on the hierarchy of evidence. And anyone who tries to remove that is fundamentally not evidence-based. So I think we need to acknowledge that. Anecdotal evidence is highly important. And it's simply, not only is it just lower on the evidence, but still on the evidence hierarchy. It's not just worse. It also fills a fundamentally different role in evidence-based practice that in many cases cannot be fulfilled by science, nor is science attempting to, nor should it attempt to. But I think where people get it wrong is we always want to ascribe a cause to an observation when sometimes we can't know that, right? So it is true that if you repeat the same intervention in the same person, whether you're sitting in the seat of the coach or the seat of the athlete who is doing robust experimentation on yourself, you can observe trends that are repeatable. You can't say that that's an inherent genetic trait, or that this is something that is unique to me or unique to this protocol. You just know that it is repeatable. It could be something related to a systematic environmental reality in your diet. Like you can have two people consuming very similar diets with different soil composition in different parts of the world, and one of them has a malnutrition issue, right?
Yeah.
You like the point is
No, if I can,
all you know is it's repeatable. You don't know why.
yeah, if I can bolster with even more stats history, I love telling a good story of Clever Hans, the horse who can count. And that was an example of what you're talking about, which is a repeatable effect where the cause has been misattributed. So Hans was a horse. Hans could count and also do some spelling. He was a very special horse. And so his trainer would tell him, hey, Hans, tell me what's 2 plus 3. And Hans the horse would, pound his hoof on the ground 5 times. He'd say, okay, that's good. But what's 7 minus 2? 5 times, They didn't always equal 5. That was a coincidence. But he would give all this basic arithmetic and the horse would get it right. And he was telling people far and wide that, hey, this horse is a genius. He can count, he can spell. And ultimately, people came in and did independent testing with the horse without the train. And people with the trainer there observed it. And they're like, oh my God, this is working. But if the trainer wasn't there and an independent group of people instructed the horse to count, it forgot how to count. It forgot how to spell. And so what was happening was there was a repeatable effect where the horse was anticipating based on body language what the trainer was anticipating and was just doing whatever it would take to get that next sugar cube, basically. So that's an example where it was a repeatable effect, but the cause was misattributed because in these single study design or, single person designs, even if we find a repeatable effect, you may think it's because you ramp up your training volume and you're an incredible responder to high volume programming, but maybe when you ramp up your training volume subconsciously, oh God, this is a lot, and you start eating more and you start really prioritizing your sleep and recovery. You start, there may be other changes you're making subconsciously when you go on these ambitious high volume programs.
It's everything. And it's part of the reason why we have many of the study designs we do, like a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial for, say, even blood pressure medication, where we do want to extrapolate it to the population. Think about where someone's head is at when they are volunteering to be part of a blood pressure trial, and the inclusion criteria is that they have high blood pressure. Once they get accepted into the trial, they're going to be highly motivated to lower their blood pressure. Just the simple acceptance into the trial means they might start exercising, they might start eating better, and that's why you see a placebo effect. It's not just magic expectancy effects. It is true behavior changes. Just like when you have people start tracking their diet, they're probably not going to get the same number of donuts at work and stick it on the scale, remember that, and write it down. They might actually not eat the donut at all.
Yeah.
People start losing weight, So these types of things are happening in these complex systems and among humans. And they happen within the individual and they happen within groups. So we do need to be aware that discerning cause and effect is a huge challenge when you are dealing with anecdotal evidence. You are changing multiple things all the time, and you do not have the parallel universe version of you who didn't do just that one thing. But you can say, you know what, I've tried this multiple times. I don't know if it's because of my genetics, my environment, or something else, but I do see the same pattern. And therefore, I'm going to act on that as a coach or as an athlete. And you would be a fool not to, in my opinion. But it's just really important to point out that most anecdotes are so much lower in quality than what we're talking about. We're not, like a high-level S&C coach who's actually sometimes running stats on their own data, calculating the coefficient of variation and things like that. They're not even, looking at spreadsheets and just looking at trends in an athlete. It's just, siloed groups of people in fitness saying, I'm pretty sure everybody trains with low volume who's made good gains. It's like, well, maybe that's just your algorithm feeding you a bunch of stuff, right?
And what's interesting about it is that I like that you decided to steel man this argument, because one of the things that I really pushed back on as I read it or heard it was just the confidence with which it was delivered. But the reality is In my opinion, what we should be doing as science communicators in the lifting space is encouraging people toward a very specific middle ground. And so there's kind of two sides of this, if we want to just really straw man and go into this really broad spectrum, you could say some people say you could never possibly detect anything meaningful from self-experimentation. And on the other hand, just do what works for you, bro. Don't think about it too hard, right? Well, what we should really be doing, in my opinion, as science communicators, is highlighting the things we just talked about, the inherent issues with self-experimentation, not being able to find true causative mechanisms, things of that nature. We should be highlighting some of the stumbling blocks that can get in your way when you're trying to interpret your own self-experimentation. And in my opinion, we should be giving people the tools to equip them with how can you do self-experimentation better? How can you make better inferences based on your observations when you train? So for example, when someone says, I really hate high volume programs because I tried it one time and it didn't work, maybe they lean on some of these concepts and say, maybe you should try it twice. Because there could be other things that happen that one time. Replication is a fundamental principle that helps you make better inferences with your self-experimentation. Trying to actually document things you're doing so you can actually standardize things well is another huge thing you can do. So in my opinion, it's not that we should be pushing people toward self-experimentation or away from self-experimentation. I think we should be focused on equipping people with a better understanding of how to interpret their own experiences. And ultimately, I think that can go. It's not to say everyone's going to be out there doing permutation tests to calculate a p-value on their own. Like, I replicated 2 different programs 10 times each in randomized order. It's probably not going to happen, right? But we can still lean on some of these concepts. But Helms, if I may, I want to just wrap up a couple of the things we talked about and then move into what I think is kind of the real climax of the episode, really wrap things up in terms of hitting what I think is the bigger picture concept here. So we talked about the first claim. You can it's literally impossible to reliably calculate the significance of an outcome using a sample size of one person. Categorically false. There's a whole body of literature on it. Many different. It's not just like one person who's out there publishing a bunch of op-eds on it. This is a robust field of statistical science. The other thing is a related claim. You cannot determine if a data point is an outlier from self-experimentation. To me, that's a pretty big flaw in logic in the sense that, of course you can. Helms, if you brought in, and let's forget all the replication stuff, Helms. You brought in a client. You started training them. You've been training them for 6 months. They've gained 26 pounds and they look leaner. You have no tools to tell whether or not that's an outlier response. You're completely lost in the dark on that? Of course you can. Yeah. We can absolutely.
Philosophically, at the very least, it makes no sense. But even mathematically, it makes no sense.
Yeah, but even if we put away all the nerd science and stat stuff, we know distributions of normative data. And again, getting to the point of pragmatic self-experimentation, we should absolutely be comparing what we see with ourselves versus what we see from everyone else, whether that's the people we train with in the gym, the people we've trained previously if we're a coach, or if we're more, research inclined, we can actually go look at the normative data and say, in a meta-analysis of 80 groups across 68 studies, training for an average of 10.4 weeks, how much fat-free mass does a human being gain when they do a resistance training program, right? These data exist. And so we don't have to pretend we're completely lost without any bearings in terms of what to expect in terms of training response. And we may not know why the results were so incredible, but we absolutely can discern if something is remarkable, unremarkable, fantastic, terrible, or extremely average, right?
If you extend that logic of we can't determine what's an outlier to the practical world and really think about it, we look at Usain Bolt. He runs a world record. And we go, what was that a world record? Was that good? Tomorrow he might run a 13.
Yeah,
and that'd be his best, and that's his normal. We can't know. We
Right.
can't know. We might as well just hand gold medals out to everybody or just cancel sports, honestly, because we don't know what's better than something else because they're all individuals.
Yeah.
We should just have a population average of sprint times. That's it.
Yeah. So those are the two things, but I want to focus now on the third one because I think this is what really I think is the most important from a podcasting perspective. So you can never determine whether self-experimentation is resulting in a meaningful outcome. Now that is a verbatim quote, and that's important. The term "meaningful" there, that is a huge conflation, a major no-no in the statistics world of implying that statistical significance is meaning and that meaning is statistical significance. It's really, really, really important that we separate those two concepts. You can have a meaningful result that, because of various factors, is not statistically significant at the group level. You could have a statistically significant effect at the group level that is pretty much meaningless. I mean, I've looked into some studies. You know, I did my dissertation on nitrate. You can look at like nitrate intake and blood pressure and find that at the population level, your systolic blood pressure is like a point and a half lower if you, or the research specifically was on mouthwash, which kills all the bacteria that facilitate that conversion of nitrate. So do I go out telling people if you use mouthwash, you're on a crash course for hypertension? Of course not. We're talking about 1 millimeter mercury change in systolic blood pressure. It's nothing, but it's interesting, right? Because if you look at over 30,000 people, it's there. It's a thing that exists.
If I may, this is actually something that we rarely run into in our world because we're always dealing with small sample size studies and we have to leverage meta-analysis to get large sample sizes in most cases. But this is a really common thing in the medical world where you do have large NIH funded studies, huge data sets, multi-site experimental trials. And exactly what you said, I think, is actually a great example: blood pressure, because there are blood pressure medications. And you have to think about the financial investment that a pharmaceutical company makes into a given drug. And they don't do it based upon statistical significance. They do it based upon, well, an asymmetrical evaluation of risk. It needs to have an extremely low risk profile so that it makes sense and can actually get through the approvals of whatever country it's going to get approved in. And then secondly, it needs to be clinically significant. And while the statistical fights that we've had in sports science are the inverse of this, this is what happens in the medical world, is typically the bar for clinical significance is higher for mathematical reasons than the bar for statistical significance. Because with a high enough sample size, and this is, I found, just a fascinating aspect of the way null hypothesis testing works and the whole family of permutation testing p-values, is that any difference in a mean will eventually become statistically significant if the sample size is large enough, if it persists.
Yeah.
So if there is a point, if there's a one systolic or one diastolic blood pressure difference in two averages, if that's represented by 2 million people in each one, it'll be statistically significant. But that is not enough to make a clinical difference in terms of someone's risk of having a heart attack or having other complications related to blood pressure. So you would not see an investment by a pharmaceutical company, and there have been a tremendous number of drugs that have an effect that is just simply not worth it to be invested in, or might come with a high enough risk of side effects that an individual might go, you know what, I'm okay with that side effect. It's only a 1% chance. But if you think about it, a 1% risk of an adverse event in a drug that's being distributed to hundreds of millions of people is a big problem. Now, again, and I'll give it back to you. I'll hand this mic back over in a second, I promise. In our field, this never happens, right? We have arguments about, for example, magnitude-based inferences, where we were making what is meaningful too low of a bar. We'd go, anything that has a Cohen's small effect size with a, 75% probability of being like real, we're going to go ahead and call that meaningful. And eventually that just kind of became an issue because it was being treated with the same binary, go, no go response rather than kind of a more holistic assessment of probability, risk, and benefit versus harm, that a p less than 0.05 or 0.06, kind of decision would be be made. So that's why magnitude-based inference largely got rejected in our field, even though some of the ideas behind it from Will Hopkins were quite good, or at least from I would say a conceptual standpoint. So yeah, clinical significance is something that is largely not understood by exercise scientists, but is a very, very common conversation and well understood in the world of medicine and pharmaceuticals especially.
Yeah, and just to spike the blood pressure of any grad students who are listening, when we talk about this relationship between p-values and sample size, it also pertains to our test of assumptions. And so one of my like kind of fringe beliefs, it's not fringe everywhere, but it's definitely fringe in exercise science, is like most of the people who are saying like, well, I know that my data are normal because of the Shapiro-Wilk test. It's like, you don't know anything, dude. Like you ran an underpowered test and you got a high p-value. You don't know if you're really conforming to a normal distribution with your residuals. Same thing goes. Like I've had people when I'm working with large data sets who are like, hey, did you do a Shapiro-Wilk test? I'm like, why would I do that? And like I've heard people who are actual statisticians who their literal what they would say is, with a large enough sample size, the Shapiro-Wilk test is a sample size test. You know, it's just, it will be significant if you have a large enough group because you're never going to get perfectly normal data. So all that is to say, when you're a grad student diligently doing your tests that your professor told you to, I just want to plant a seed of doubt that stresses you out because I don't have any good suggestions. But that's a topic for another day. But anyway, the other reason I wanted to bring up that third statement there, that you can never determine whether self-experimentation is resulting in a meaningful outcome, getting away from the stats and just getting into the premise of evidence-based practice. I think that statement is a massive violation of evidence-based principles as it pertains to, like I said, evidence-based practice. So when you look at evidence-based practice, you can argue, some people put it as like a Venn diagram with 3 circles. Some people do it as more of a funnel because they want to create a bit of a hierarchy in terms of how you integrate that evidence. But evidence-based practice, I think it's very widely accepted, has 3 elements. And you can talk about them as, 3 legs of a stool, 3 parts of a Venn diagram, 3 parts of a funnel. But it's the best available scientific evidence. That's your typical RCTs, the stuff we review in mass. The expertise of the clinician, and then the patient values and preferences, basically the individualized circumstances. And so when we talk about completely eliminating observations from self-experimentation, we're basically saying that's a nice 3-legged stool you got there. It'd be a shame if I kicked one of the legs out, right? Like, and I think what's most important to kind of highlight about that is that, Helms, I know we've worked in evidence-based fitness. We write mass articles. We do podcasting. We've coached individuals. We've coached ourselves. And within the context of evidence-based fitness, especially when you're working with a client, it's not only that self-experimentation is important. It's that self-experimentation is kind of the only thing that actually matters. And so to me, that's why that last statement is such a huge breach of that underlying principle of evidence-based practice. Is when you tell a person who's lifting, even if we just lay out an example, right? So a coach does an intervention at a client's request and the coach is skeptical. You've probably been there, right? Your client's really adamant. I want to try this. And you say, I don't think that's going to work, but fine. I see no reason to believe it would be harmful. We can give it a shot, right? And it works marvelously compared to that client's recent results. You've been coaching them for 3 years, and this is the biggest spike in performance you've seen in a year and a half, right? And so the coach says, okay, well, let's repeat that. Let's try that again, see if it was a fluke, and what do you know? It works marvelously again. So at that point, your coach has 2 options in this scenario. They can either say, well, that's not supposed to happen and never do it again, or say, great, we're making gains that we haven't unlocked in a year and a half. This is an absolute revelation for your training. Let's keep doing it until we run into some breaks here. Like, let's keep rolling with it. And of course, obviously the answer is you roll with it. At the end of the day, a long-term engagement in fitness is an endless period of self-experimentation that is guided by the other evidence we have. the expertise of other practitioners and clinicians, the peer-reviewed evidence that's getting churned out every single month. But at the end of the day, if you're a world-class powerlifter and the thing that allowed you to increase your bench by 100 pounds wasn't supposed to work based on the recent meta-analysis, what the hell do you care, Helms? Now, is that the most likely scenario, that you're just going to be turning over these rocks and being 20 steps ahead of the science every turn you make? Probably not. But again, we can't get too far out of reach of these basic principles that help us understand why we're here in the first place. And that is, the experience at the individual level is what we're here for in virtually all elements of fitness.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's worth going all the way back to, why does exercise science use null hypothesis testing, random sampling, and all the design fundamentals that we teach in a graduate level class? And it's because the default assumption of what we do with this information is to provide recommendations to populations, whether that's a group of athletes in sports science, coaches, whether that is population physical activity guidelines, or in nutrition science, things that become pyramids or plates, or whatever the given non-governmental body wants to do. So in that context, there isn't really a place, and I get it, for the individual data. There is lip service paid to it of what happens when you are a clinician and you sit down and you talk through these guidelines with a person, and how do you translate them into practice, and then what do you change, which becomes a whole complete inversion, where eventually the only thing you care about is the observable patterns within that person. And then you're we understand volume as a way of turning up the dose of the thing we're doing, right? And I can determine whether that dose is too high for you or too less, or the right amount. But then when you're writing a review paper, recommendations, evidence-based recommendations for natural bodybuilders, I know some people who've written those types of papers. They may be represented on this podcast. That is where we are purely looking at the highest quality level of evidence. We might give some nods to how this might be applied in the real world because practitioners are reading it. But ultimately, it would be a disservice for us to look at cherry-picked single studies. We are trying to use the well-done, most recent meta-analyses on this topic to inform those broad population-level guidelines. And it's why we provide ranges, and we provide levels of confidence, and things like grade assessments to say, hey, the certainty of this evidence is higher or lower, and why we have an evidence hierarchy so that we can make these population-level recommendations. And I think where people really get caught up in the fitness industry, and why there's this current fight back against the quote-unquote science-based content, is missing that these are two fundamentally different things. That, like, people respond and don't know what's wrong with it. Of, okay, well, if high volume is shown in these meta-analyses to reliably produce higher performances, then why did Jeff Nippard get better gains in his video when he did lower volume? And that is, whether the person who says it realizes it or not, that's like saying, well, if gravity works, then why did this one time this astronaut let go of a ball that didn't fall? Like, there is a reason, and in this case, it's because you're not in a gravity well, right? But assuming you don't know that fundamental principle, they don't need to conflict. They're different contexts, right? So we just have to not assume that what we see in one person must always follow the population level data in a controlled environment when it is uncontrolled. And we just have to be comfortable. And this is a big ask, because humans do not like existential threats. We have to be comfortable with not knowing why an observation happened, which we don't like. We like to make up all kinds of myths. Every culture has done it to explain everything we observe. And I'm not taking a shot at myths or religion or anything like that. I'm just saying that's the way humans are. We like to explain things. And people who are interested in science sometimes even need to be able to explain things and want to explain them before they actually have a true rationale that is sufficiently robust to become like a theory to explain something in all instances. So when we're dealing with individuals, when we're doing evidence-based practice, we need to maintain a level of humility that is open to the idea that this person might respond in a unique way, but also have a level of humility to say, and we don't necessarily know why, and that's okay. And it doesn't contradict anything that we see in science. It just means that there's more to know. So again, just the importance of humility and curiosity when you're engaging with science, because that is the fundamental underlying stance that you need to take philosophically if you want to be a true empiricist.
Yeah, and I think that's such a great way to put it. I was trying to think of how to hammer this point home, and getting back to that, kind of, it's not a dichotomy, but it's a spectrum of that kind of open-mindedness versus skepticism in this evidence-based fitness scene that we inhabit. And I think one of my biggest concerns about when people, especially early in their career, adopt the ultra skeptical posture, and they get very much into the I'm going to defend you from the bad information out there. I'm going to debunk everything. That's kind of my posture in terms of content creation. I think that immediate bias towards skepticism, and it is a bias, like, let's not kid ourselves. I think it completely poisons you against curiosity. And I think that is a trap that a lot of people in evidence-based fitness fall into. And that is, I become so skeptical because I heard that was a virtue in the evidence-based scene that now I am completely devoid of curiosity. And when I hear something that conflicts with my, PubMed link of the month that I've been really liking, I don't react well to that. And instead of asking why that would be or what the context is for it, I say, sounds like bullshit to me. And then I make a definitive statement declaring that it's clearly not true, right? So I think that evidence-based fitness collectively, we have to do something that's very, very difficult. Like, I don't want to pretend that this is easy to do, but we have to practice a level of skepticism without becoming cynical. We need to practice this kind of moderated, even-keeled version of skepticism that doesn't totally poison our curiosity and our open-mindedness. And I think that what's interesting to me is, and I'm not pointing fingers because I think I followed kind of a similar trajectory where when I knew nothing about science, I wasn't skeptical at all. I would read the muscle mags and say, oh, hell yeah, let's do it. Believe me, I bought plenty of L-arginine and branched chain amino acids for the both of us, right? So initially I was like, I'm interested in this stuff, and I'm throwing skepticism by the wayside because I'll take anything that works. And apparently a lot of things that don't work as well. Then I started getting into science, and I think the point where a lot of folks become ultra skeptical and even bordering on cynical is like year 1 or 2 of grad school, where it's like you're past the undergrad stuff, you've got your filter, you're really like getting into how to interpret research, but you're kind of like on defense and wielding the sword, like really aggressively defending against new ideas. And I think usually end of undergrad to like first year or 2 of grad school, people become hyper skeptical to the point of sometimes cynical. And then after you've been in the business for a while, and when I say the business, I mean doing research, you start to realize, oh, this is just another imperfect way of making observations about the world around us. And the observations I make when I'm doing a research study are fundamentally different than the observations I make when I coach my clients, which are fundamentally different than the observations I make when I'm in the gym. And at the end, which are fundamentally different from the inferences I make when I'm chatting with coaches at a conference and just talking shop. And initially, that year 1 grad school hyper skeptical, hyper cynical person has no interest in these other forms of evidence because they're all PubMed focused. And the longer you get into it, the more you realize, that was a mistake. I should have been more curious about other sources of information. I should have been more curious about information that pushes against my current beliefs and cause me to grow academically and intellectually rather than defend intellectually or academically. And I think that's kind of the big take home from me is making sure that we maintain our level of curiosity and open-mindedness, keeping our mind open enough, but not so much that it falls out. And I think I'm not going to pretend that that's easy to do, but I think that really is the challenge for evidence-based fitness.
Well said. I have one final thought to add, and that is it, because I think you said that so well, is that kind of the next leveling up from there of once you kind of have that humility, sometimes via negative experience and touching the stove and getting burned, of going, oh, maybe there's value in different sources of evidence, whether it is from the research, from my own experience, from the experience of others, whether they're athletes or coaches, all those site information cited, is to then determine the different limitations of each one. Because I think the times where your brain falls out is when you kind of you basically poison your own well, and you think, oh man, I thought I knew everything. You come down from Dunning-Kruger, but then you feel this loss of confidence because you're like, I don't know what I know. But you probably know more. And John Kiley talked about this after, he kind of had his periodization bubble like popped and can't predict outcomes. I know nothing. And everything is just like, it could have been because you're in traffic today. But once you are now open to the idea that there's a lot of other sources of information, things, the blind spots you had could be influencing it, this is when you can start to go, okay, well, what are the limitations of the research? What are the limitations of my experience? What are the limitations of my coaching experience? And what are the limitations of other coaching's experience? And then you move even further and you go, I can actually start to quantify the likely contribution of these different things to this outcome. It's not like that fight with your wife could make you lose 30 kilos of muscle by tomorrow, right? But it might mess up your high-skilled performance today, right? But to what degree, right? And is it mitigatable? And where do you get the strategies to mitigate it from? Which of those sources of evidence? And that's the type of place that you want to move towards. So there is always a leveling up. But that leveling up process for an evidence-based practitioner must include all of these sources of information.
And it's going to include a lot of humility and I think some degree of, like you said, touching the stove and being overconfident and then finding out, oops, I was wrong. And honestly, to some extent, I think some degree of disillusionment. If we're being totally honest, I think you can tell me if I'm wrong. I think most people that get into exercise science do it because they say, this is this perfect or nearly perfect way of finding out all real truths in the world. And then you kind of see how the sausage is made and you say, I still believe this stuff is useful and good and worthwhile, but there's more blemishes here than I thought. And there's, more unreliable research than I would have thought. And so it kind of, I think that plays a big role in causing, some of these people that wave around PubMed links, but have never really stepped foot inside of a lab and never been, in the peer review publishing process. I think a lot of them, once they do take that step and get into it, they say, oh, I was really confident in some studies that looking back at it are really just weren't done very well, So it's not to say that we should have less faith in research, so to speak, but we need to, like you said, integrate all the information available from different sources and understand the limitations of each of them. And ultimately, that's the goal. If you want to silo yourself away and deal with only one leg of the stool, that's your prerogative, but you better understand that you are willingly tying a hand behind your back. So you can pretend it's virtuous if you like, but you're only doing yourself a disservice if the goal is to get beefy and strong. And that's the goal, right? Let's be honest.
Should be.
All right, Helms, anything else you want to say to the good people before we wrap up and close out the show?
No, just thank you for tuning in. Happy New Year. And don't be the person who decided to sit down on a one-legged stool.
Yeah, don't do that. And if you're in the gym and you see somebody that needs a hand, use your best judgment. Maybe it's the right time to be helpful. If they look like they're a little lost or confused, maybe they need to work things out on their own. But most importantly, make sure that you contribute to a welcoming environment in your gym. There's going to be a lot of people there this week that are not regulars. And what more could we want as a fitness community than to have more regulars, right? More people who are joining the culture and, new brothers and sisters in iron, right? So everybody, thank you for joining us. Have a fantastic week, and we will see you next week with another episode of Iron Culture.